I would like now to take this time to just introduce Gayatri. Gayatri has been working with Generation Atomic for as a fellow for quite a while, but she is much more than that. She is an international climate law and policy specialist and a clean energy advocate in London. She is an IAEA Maria Sklodowska Curie Fellow. She is currently pursuing a master's in law with a focus on nuclear financing. She's participated in many multilateral, multi-nation negotiations across the UN, the IAEA, the OECD, and Interpol. But she's here in her role today as the founder and director of Climate Policy Practice, which is a public education platform which she has brought to over 1,000 people and will now be bringing to you. So, will everyone please welcome with me Gayatri?
Thank you so much for having me in your Atomic Ambassador meeting and also opening it up to people who would be interested in this topic. So, as Philip introduced me, my name is Gayatri Karnik. I have been with Generation Atomic for a little, almost a year now, and in their capacity as an international policy fellow. So, I just go to international meetings and talk to people about nuclear energy. But my background is international law and policy. So that's why one of my greatest passions currently is the climate framework and how international policy can help or hurt our progress towards our climate targets. So that's why I started these series of workshops on international climate law and policy to try to demystify sort of this very complex international structure and make it accessible to people who are working in the policy space or who are adjacent to the policy space and try to understand sort of where we can have impacts. So that's what I do with the initiative, Climate Policy Practice. And today I'll be talking to you more about sort of how the energy frameworks work within this sort of like behemoth of an instrument that's the UN Climate Conventions. And I think today is a good sort of day to talk about this because I'm sure, as you've heard, yesterday President signed the accords to leave the Paris Agreement. And we'll sort of look at what the implications of that are because Paris Agreement, I believe, is our most important and best shot at meeting our climate targets. And so, if we don't have one of the world's biggest contributors to climate change within this international framework, what are the consequences of that? I think that will also be made apparent today. So, yeah, this is just sort of more of a picture depiction of what I do. I go to international conventions all over the place. This is what five countries, six continents, sorry, countries, six conferences, and talk to people about climate change. And these conferences are essentially international negotiations. And the point of these negotiations are coming up with policy frameworks at the end of them so that we can understand what went on in these conferences. And so this is just what I do. And this is what I do with climate policy practice, which is I go to schools, colleges, and talk to people like you who are interested in climate change and policy and explain to them about the functions of these agreements and how they impact our overall commitments towards climate change. So this is just a short sort of introduction of my initiative. I'm sure this group doesn't need an introduction to what climate change is, but defining some features of it will help us understand sort of where the UN climate framework comes into place when we're thinking of trying to find solutions for it. So, this is what the UNFCCC, which is the main climate instrument, thinks of climate change, a change in climate, indirectly or directly caused by human activity that causes an alteration in the composition of the global atmosphere. So, a pretty simple definition. I think like doing this via graphs is a better way of understanding what the current issue is. Time we've been hitting these milestones every year. There's a very high likelihood that 2025 is going to be hotter than 2024. And this year we have actually passed our threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have been getting hotter and hotter, and our sort of baseline for this period is the Industrial Revolution. Even though in this chart we start from 1940s, the idea is that baseline Industrial Revolution was functionally a period of rapid change in the economy, and it essentially caused people to start using fossil fuels. And what do fossil fuels do? They release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which increase emissions. And so, since the Industrial Revolution, since the 1800s, global annual CO2 emissions have been steadily rising in a fashion that's very similar to the global temperature rise. So we can sort of draw correlations between these two factors and say that temperatures are rising because greenhouse gases are increasing. The emissions overall in our human-related activities are increasing, and this sort of started in the 1800s. How important is energy in this idea of framework? In the sort of cause and effect of climate change. You have heard maybe going vegan for the environment. That's good. That has nothing to do with energy. And maybe like even burning waste and cement production produces some greenhouse gases and heating effects that are negative to the environment. So we know fossil fuels are bad, right? Fundamentally. But how bad in terms of scope? 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from come from energy sources. Now, this is energy sources in different uses, industry, transport, in like housing applications, and like a lot of different sectors. But energy is one of the largest sectors and largest contributors to climate change. Without respect to any other factor, if we fix our energy systems, we will be able to fix climate change by and large. And so, what are sort of some causes within the energy sector of emissions? Coal, natural gas, oil, biogas. These are essentially the bottom chart is the total energy supply, and the top chart is about the greenhouse gases that come out of this. So the chart on the right is a little bit more modern. It's from 2022. So as you can see, still out of the entire energy system in the world, 80% of our energy comes, 80 to 85% of our energy comes from fossil fuel sources. And a lot of it is still extremely, extremely bad for the environment. How do you fix this? Again, the answer is relatively simple in practice. So shift to clean energy sources, solar, wind, nuclear, improve energy efficiency. But these sort of like small term fixes have within them the 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 idea that we require an economic transformation along with our energy transition because all these sectors that are dependent on energy are incredibly tied to an economy of a country. So the solution is easy in theory, but moving to low carbon sources, there is a huge, it is very difficult in practice because low carbon technologies are more expensive than fossil fuels. And most of the developed world relies on fossil fuels. And so to scale up these technologies is essentially the real challenge of the climate crisis. And as we saw before, it's a global crisis. It is an issue that every single country in the world is facing right now. And the solutions have to be global also, because the sources of greenhouse gas emissions come from every single country in the world. Most of the countries that are in the sort of top 10 emitters are developing countries that are trying to build up their economies. And functionally, this used to happen historically through fossil fuel sources. But now, since we no longer have those options, we are transitioning to a clean energy systems, which are not possible for countries like China and India at the speed that's required to meet our climate goals. So, what do we do when we have an international issue that requires coordinated global action? We go to the UN. The UN is founded in 1945. Some basic facts. It has 193 member countries and six major organs. So the UN is essentially what we go to when we want to think of issues that require international cooperation to solve. This might be a very familiar picture to you on the left. The UN does a lot of sort of aid related work. They go to different countries, they talk to people about their like diseases, pandemics, they do food deliveries. But that's just one part of what the UN does. That's the executive. This is the legislature, and I wonder how many people can identify the legislature from different countries. The one on the top left is the UNGA. The one on the top right is the Indian Lok Sabha, which is the sort of lower house. The one below that is the House of Representatives from the US, and the one beside that is the House of Commons in the United Kingdom. So a lot of local level representation essentially works by selecting somebody from your constituency to go to represent you at the national level, right? That is the point of having a democracy. That is representative democracy in action. The UN works very similar to this in a sense that every single country comes together and elects a representative at the national level, and they send their representative to the UN. And this is what comes up when we think of international law. The UN legislation is nothing but all countries coming together and representing their constituents and coming up with solutions to global issues. Now, this is good in the sense that you have a stake in what goes on at the UN if you live in a democracy, because you elect your representatives who go to the UN to represent you and bring your problems to that point. But then that also means there are 193 different countries with very diverse interests, with very different agendas that have to come together to solve collective issues. And if they can't come to a consensus, there's essentially no law formed. And so that is why the UN, you might have heard maybe good things about it, bad things about it. Mainly it comes in the news for being inefficient and not meeting the sort of goals that it has set out to do. And that's largely not because of the structure of the UN itself, not because of the UN as a body or UN as an instrument, but because of what goes on within it. It's a very political process that makes it hard to reach consensus. But we have to reach consensus, right? Climate change is such an important global issue that requires coordinated global action. And so, is a system like the UN fit for purpose to serve something like an issue as devastating and as imminent as the climate crisis? Another very interesting and unfortunate, perhaps, feature of international law is the fact that the power comes from the people. And so the state gives power to the UN. And that means that the laws at the international level are voluntary. Over here in your country, if you break a law, if you're caught speeding, if you're caught committing a crime, you are bound by the laws of your country and bound by the jurisdiction of your country to serve some time in prison. You will be prosecuted. But in the UN level, you have an option whether you want to be bound by these laws or no. Even if you sign a treaty, even if you come up with a consensus of what these laws are, there is always a possibility to step outside of this framework and say you don't want to be bound by them anymore. And that is what makes international law so fickle, the fact that you can always leave it if you are no longer bound by it. And I think this is demonstrated very well in what the news was yesterday, that the US has left the Paris Agreement, which is sort of our main goal, our main instrument to fight climate change. And you can do that. You can leave any international commitment because the price of entering and exiting is essentially your reputation. There are very little implementation mechanisms, but there are fewer mechanisms of enforcement. So if countries are not bound by their regulation anymore, then they can just leave. And that is what makes sticking to international policy so hard, given the fact that every single country has their own sort of agendas in this case. But we must persist because, again, this is what we have right now. So, in the entire climate framework, how do you sort of work through this dilemma of many countries coming together, having to formulate a single policy framework that should be applying to all of them? We started with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's called the UNFCCC for short, in 1992. So in 1992, we had not just the foresight and thought that climate change was going to be an issue. This was happening way before that, but then we had an idea that we need to work together to solve this as an issue, as a global crisis. Now there needs to be some kind of coordination between parties to ensure that whatever we end up doing is coordinated at the national level so that the outcomes are beneficial for all of us. But then we still didn't see any climate action because the cost of climate action is extremely high economically, but also politically. But essentially, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, stabilized GHG concentrations to prevent. The goal was to stabilize GHG concentrations. But then the idea was to essentially set the framework for future conventions. It wasn't a very ambitious instrument. It did not set binding reduction targets on anything, but it did establish a very fundamental principle in the UN climate space called common but differentiated responsibilities that acknowledges, and which is very rare in a UN convention, that acknowledges sort of the historic trajectory of climate change, of the fossil fuels being part of this entire story of development. And the people who are able to benefit from it, which is the global north countries, they are no longer bound by it. But the countries that do not have the possibility of developing in a cheap fashion, the developing countries and the underdeveloped countries, they will be bearing the brunt and the cost of this. And also, the people who are most vulnerable to climate change are the people in the poor countries who do not have the resources to rebuild after major climate events. And as you're seeing right now, even in developed countries, the idea of rebuilding after climate disasters keeps getting more expensive. So the people who are worse off, the people who are contributing least to the issue, end up suffering the most or the first. Because at the end of the day, everybody is going to be bound by the impacts of climate change. But the ones who will sort of feel most of the impact are the ones that had the least to contribute to its outcomes. So they established this issue that all of us have sort of a collective responsibility to fight climate change, but the way that we get there is different and it looks different for all the countries. They set another very important factor, which is the conference of parties. Maybe you've heard of this. It keeps coming up in conversations annually about what climate change is and how we are fighting towards it. It's called the COP. And COP stands for Conference of Parties. So every time you have a big UN treaty, treaties are the like really internationally binding commitments that countries are making, like as binding as international law can get. They come, they negotiate on what possibly they could do. They agree to meet every year or every 2 years, depending on what sort of the policy is, and discuss how they are doing towards the implementation of the treaty, domestically and then internationally. And this is what COPs are. COPs essentially are just an annual meeting, and they can be COP for biodiversity, they can be COP for desertification, or they can be COP for climate. And since climate change is such an important issue. And within the UN framework, the climate issue is the most sort of important in a sense that it attracts the most amount of people. It's essentially gotten the name COP as a catch-all. So when you hear of COP, it just means the 29th meeting. The last COP that we had was COP 29 in Baku. So COP 29 just means the 29th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Convention. And this means that every subsequent convention that came up under the UN Climate Convention has a separate COP, but they all meet together. And that is why it's called COP 29, even though it was a meeting of also the Kyoto COP and the Paris COP. So those are just sort of some idiosyncrasies of the climate process. So the next agreement we came up with, we decided that the UNFCCC wasn't sufficient enough. We wanted meeting our goals under it. So in just a span of 5 years, we decided to restart the negotiations and we came up with the Kyoto Protocol. And so Kyoto Protocol was far more ambitious than what the UNFCCC was. In fact, it overcorrected from what the goals of the UNFCCC was. So it set binding targets for countries. And as we've seen, international law can be exited as countries need it. It is not applicable. So if you set very strict binding standards for countries, they'll just decide it's in their best interest to perform your climate commitments outside of this, or best to not just join in the first place. So it was sort of the issues with Kyoto were twofold. It only concentrated on developed countries that had the capacity to decarbonize at that time. It did not focus on major emitters like China and India that like now slowly have overtaken. China has overtaken the US as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. And it was only focused on developed countries. And it also set very, very restrictive standards on these countries. So even though they were part of these negotiations, the US never ratified the protocol. And a lot of other developed countries felt too restricted by this process, so they exited it. And there was not a there was a lack of an enforcement mechanism. This, I think, is true throughout the process, but when you have such high binding standards for countries, having an enforcement mechanism is very useful because that just goes to show that there would be a punishment for it if you don't have compliance. But then countries just left the protocol, and that is why the Kyoto is seen as the least effective of these processes, even though it's still being discussed in the UN policy frameworks. Uh, and so both these approaches were top down. Essentially, all the countries came together at the UN and decided that these are our overarching goals. And so the UN came down to the countries again, saying that this is what you need to do to reach these goals. And that top down approach was not very successful, as we saw both times, with like little enforcement and no, not that many binding commitments, and even with very, very binding commitments, these didn't really like fit the mold that we wanted. These weren't producing the kind of results that we wanted. So we started negotiating on the third climate treaty under this was sort of the most important framework that came out of the last 20 years. It's called the Paris Agreement. And if you've heard some very, very, how do you say, basic commitments and goals in climate circles, this is where it comes from. The idea of limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees with an effort to limit it to 1.5 degrees. This is Celsius, but I'm sure our American viewers can do the translations in Fahrenheit. But this is our North Star essentially. 1.5 is our effort, and then 2 is the maximum. We do not want the emissions to be any higher than 2 degrees because of the devastating impacts that a global annual temperature that's about 2 degrees will cause. And so this idea of limiting temperature rise comes from the Paris Agreement, and that has essentially been incorporated into a lot of other frameworks. To every single sort of idea that comes out of the Paris Agreement has to set the goal as 2 degrees. So, and it also was a bottom up kind of mechanism where it asked countries themselves to set voluntary emission reduction standards that will be reviewed every 5 years. And instead of the UN coming to them, because every country has a different situation, every country has a different circumstance, instead of going from the top to the bottom, they ask countries to submit their own emission standards and own emission reduction targets. And these are called the NDCs and is the life sort of line of the UNFCCC, and we'll see how this framework works. It's pretty intuitive when you think about it. The Paris Agreement framework starts by asking countries to submit its own climate action plans. So countries will decide what it can do based on its economy, based on what it has access to, what are its own sort of policy metrics, and they will submit to the UN its own national climate action plans called the nationally determined contributions. Then every 2 years, alongside the national climate action plans, they'll also submit domestic emissions reports. So, in fact, they're being very transparent with how they're trying to implement these climate action plans. And then the UN can collect these national climate action, like domestic emissions reports, every 5 years to come up with this global stock take. Stock take essentially is an inventory of everything we have done so far to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees. So Paris Agreement goals are the benchmark, and the stock take essentially is a technical process where every single country's progress towards the goals are evaluated. And then we decide, are we meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement or are we not? This is a technical process. And based on this technical documentation, we have a political process that identifies what we can and cannot do under energy, under agriculture, under waste management to reduce emissions further. So the first major national climate action plans came up in 2020. It's 2025. The next climate action plans, the second round of climate action plans are due this year. And in between those, in 23, the global stocktake took place. So you're getting it. It's a 5-year cycle offset by 3 years so that the impacts and sort of the political commitments that are made in the global stocktake exercise are being implemented in the next round of climate action plans. So the idea is that every subsequent plans the country submit is more ambitious and greater in its scope than the previous one. And this makes it so that countries do not backslide on their ambitions and are gradually moving up to the goals of the Paris Agreement. There is an understanding that meeting the 1.5 to 2 degree benchmark is difficult for countries, especially countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. So that is why coming up with like policies in the middle through the global stocktake that are especially sort of focused on energy systems is very important so that we can all get on the same page on what we can and cannot do. So the global stocktake was 2 years ago in Dubai. And despite it coming from a largely petro state, it was a very ambitious piece of document that, especially when it came to its energy outcomes. This is the energy outcomes paragraph from the outcomes of the global stocktake. So after all the countries analyzed the technical document, they realized that there is a lot more that needs to be done, especially in terms of the energy transition, in order to meet our 1.5 to 2 degree target. So this is what all the countries, 193 countries, agreed to at Dubai under the Paris Agreement. Triple renewable energy, double energy efficiency, phase down of unabated coal, transition away from fossil fuels, phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, this is a very, very ambitious piece of document because all countries, many of them are fossil fuel producers, not just consumers. They create fossil fuels and their entire economies are dependent on fossil fuels. They were able to agree to this. And you would be surprised on how fewer times fossil fuels as a concept enters into the UN space, into the UN climate space, even though it is the predominant driver of climate change. But this is what they agreed to. And another very, very important thing that they agreed to was accelerating zero and low carbon emission technologies, which amongst was nuclear. And this is one of the first time that the UN has acknowledged nuclear energy as a potential solution to the climate crisis. So, what this means in general for nuclear energy, although it's not as ambitious as the nuclear pledge that was happening on the margins of COP, that wasn't officially within the UN framework, that just happened on the side. What this does for nuclear energy is that it is now part of the UN solution and the UN sort of idea of what we could possibly do to achieve our ambitions under the Paris Agreement. And even though we as nuclear advocates and we as people in the nuclear sort of industry are familiar with this idea that nuclear is a zero emissions technology, it is good for the planet. There are so many benefits when it comes to the energy transition for nuclear energy. This acknowledgement makes it more mainstream and it makes it a policy alternative to other sources of energy that are clean, like renewable energy. And so this is a very important, although not very ambitious in its wording, it is essentially our foot in the door to accelerate the discussions of nuclear energy in the UN policy place. So, although again, this entire paragraph 28, that talks about the energy transition, was a difficult paragraph to, how do you say, difficult paragraph for countries to agree to. Some people felt these negotiations were a little bit rushed because what ended up happening last time was people could not even agree to this. COP28 was the energy outcomes paragraph. This COP29 in Baku last year essentially wanted to reaffirm our commitments to this paragraph. And we could not agree because just sort of it became a little bit controversial for countries to discuss. because it does talk about quite a few things that countries may not be for anymore. But this, as a piece of international law, is a good start for us to talk about other aspects of the energy transition. But essentially, this is how the UN climate framework works, especially given the Paris Agreement. Now, the new round, the next crop of national climate action plans (NDCs) will be coming up before COP 13. And so one of them is the American NDC that's already come out last year, in fact, in December, which also mentions very briefly the role of nuclear energy. The United Arab Emirates has also submitted a nationally determined contribution that is extensive about its usage of nuclear energy in its climate action plans. And so the idea is to keep up with what the countries are saying about these about their energy systems, because this is the most important officially communicated piece of document that countries have about their climate targets and climate action plans. This is more legitimate than what like presidents say. This is more legitimate than what like internal policy metrics they have for themselves, because this is communicated to the UN and it's done under an official capacity of the UNFCCC. It's a legal piece of document. And so that this was COP 28. This was happening last year, right? This happened 2 years ago, and now this year we have the NDC submissions. And so what happens in between them? We have policy, which came out. We came up with very ambitious policy, and now we have to put those policies into our country frameworks, right? Policy and action. What bridges the gap? Finance. COP 29 was a finance COP. It was discussing mainly how we will enable financial flows to allow countries to implement a very ambitious outcomes from last time, from like COP 28 into our national climate action plans. And so this climate finance COP was discussing how much finance do we need and how much finance will be able to mobilize. And climate finance is essentially like development finance, where the global north or countries, OECD countries, end up giving money through loans, grants, or other financial instruments to developing countries to build out their climate commitments and to build things under their NDCs. And so, since again, nuclear energy is within this framework, within the UN climate framework, there is a possibility, it doesn't happen right now, but there is a possibility to transition away from fossil fuels via nuclear energy that will be included within this framework. So that is why it's important to keep track of what's happening in these instruments, because it allows further action. And so what are agreements this year? We decided to mobilize 300 billion annually by 2035 from a wide range of sources, public, private, bilateral and multilateral, and alternative sources. And the idea is the 300 billion is given to the countries, and which will further mobilize 1.3 trillion. And although these numbers seem really high, 300 billion annually, they are a drop in the bucket of what we actually need for climate action globally, which is 6 trillion by 2030. So, with what we achieved through international cooperation and what ended up happening were very disparate in terms of their outcomes and impacts. And so, it's again very important to keep track of what's happening in these frameworks, because if we don't get the amount of financing required, we will fall short of our climate agreements. Countries won't be as ambitious in their national climate action plans, and they won't be delivering the kind of results that we want because they won't have anything to finance it with. So, finance is the key for implementation. And unfortunately, last year we lacked significantly on the thresholds that we had set up even for ourselves. But this, in fact, was seen as largely a failure, especially by the global south countries, because they weren't able to achieve the threshold that they wanted, which was even starting at 1 trillion, right? 300 billion is essentially 30% of what the floor was. And there were a lot of sort of issues that went into this. COP started in November, and November was a period when we had, right before November, was the US elections. And after the US elections, we sort of knew what direction the US was going to take when it comes to the Paris Agreement, because last term also, Trump had left the Paris Agreement, had left the convention, and so it was not fair or it wasn't sort of ethical to depend on the the US for climate financing, which is one of the largest contributors to development and climate finance globally. And so there were a lot of contributing factors as to why this COP ended up being so disappointing. But hopefully next year at Brazil, we are able to maintain the momentum, even without US being part of these negotiations. The official US delegation, that is, there are still a lot of like participants from the US that still are able to contribute to this process. And maybe sort of the last sort of main important point on how the UN negotiates climate is this idea of mitigation and adaptation. I think this idea is pretty well known. Uh, on like what it's trying to achieve. Mitigation is essentially the idea of reducing or preventing greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere. And adaptation is adjusting to the adverse effects that climate change is causing. Climate change is here. We are seeing the impacts of this right now. Half of Los Angeles is burning, and there's nothing that we can really do about it. And the impacts of climate change are being felt all over the world. And so the idea is that we will need to adapt our infrastructure and we will have to adapt our energy systems, our education systems, our healthcare systems to meet a future where there is a very little predictability in climate. But if we are just adapting, if that is where we are spending our money, then we don't have money or we don't have resources to contribute to mitigation, which is what's going to stop climate change, which is what is going to bring down our global temperature rise, or at least halt it at the current place that it is. And so it becomes a very difficult conversation on how much resources you want to put in adaptation versus mitigation. And the UN has decided in its all infinite glory and wisdom that we are going to allocate 50% of our resources to adaptation and 50% of our resources to mitigation. And this is just how it is for the moment. And there is also another component to climate action under the UNFCCC, which is the loss and damage. This idea of compensating after the damages that climate change has caused, what countries can and cannot do. But that's a little outside of sort of the core system of the UN, which is mitigation and adaptation. And they treat these two equally. I'm sure you can guess where energy sits under. It sits under mitigation. Energy is largely contributing to mitigation action, but there is a little bit of adaptation also required because we need to sort of solidify and make our energy systems more resilient to climate change and make it more in tandem with the kind of world that's going to be having more extreme weather events. And our energy demands are going to increase in winters because winters are going to get cold, and increase in summers because summers are going to get hot and we require air conditioning. So essentially, energy sits in both of these places. And that is why technology is such a critical component of the UN climate framework. But unfortunately, it doesn't get the kind of attention it requires. Last year, the year before last, under the GST outcomes, was sort of a big highlight for energy, but there is no separate negotiation track to talk about just energy and what we need under the energy transition. So, does the UN have an impact then? Does all our agreements that we've come to under the UNFCCC, under the Paris Agreement, under Kyoto, have they been useful at all? Right? GHG emissions are rising. Globally, temperatures are getting hotter, planet's getting hotter. We are not anywhere near our targets of 1.5. Is there does this like entire fuss that does like meeting in like different countries every year that like also causes so much emissions through transport? Is it really worth it? I would argue yes, very much, because the UN system and this UN climate framework, although imperfect, is our best shot. Had we not had global coordinated policy action, we would be significantly worse off. So 5 degrees Celsius would have been sort of incredibly devastating. We are at 1.5 nearly, and this is the kind of like world that we live in, where there is like there's fire, there is so much climate calamity happening around us. And imagine a world with 5, 4, or even 3 degrees. Right now, our plans take us between 2.2 to 2.9. So we are still not under 2 degrees. But that is why the Paris Agreement framework is a framework rather than a stipulation, where you work with countries subsequently in every new round of commitments to ensure that we are within this 2 degree threshold that we have set up for ourselves. And it's difficult, but this is the time where we need to take extremely critical action. This decade, 2020 to 2030, this is a climate decade for critical action, because the policy frameworks that we set in place will give rise to infrastructure that will give rise to action in the next decade, in the decade after that. And the energy systems that we set up in this period will bear fruit few years down the line. So right now, whatever we are doing is insufficient internationally, but even domestically, whatever you can do, advocate for nuclear energy, advocate for cleaner technologies all around you is very important, because this what we set up right now will be responsible for our net zero targets in 2050, net zero targets in the coming years. So again, what can you do? Eh, On an individual level, I think it's very easy. Reduce consumption. And I think everybody over here, since we are so sort of involved in the energy space, just learn where your energy comes from. What is the composition of energy? And think a little bit more critically about your energy consumption. Also, think beyond local action. National and international action is where it is most likely to have an impact. Uh, be mindful of what your country is passing as policies under climate action, because unless we saw how like important energy is to this issue, unless you're not talking about energy to people, if you're not like hounding them with questions about like energy, the energy transition, the impact that you're having is significantly less. So energy is a critical issue area for everything related to climate, and I think it needs to be brought back into the agenda in the UN framework, but also outside of it. And if you aren't already, like, become a climate energy advocate. And this is just a very fun group picture that we had at COP 29 from Nuclear for Climate. So that is the presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, Generation Atomic, for this audience and this space. So if you want to get in touch, my email address is g.karnik@Climate Policy Practice. You can visit us at climatepolicypractice.org to see sort of what is the link between practice and policy in the climate space. And if you aren't already, please add me on LinkedIn so we can continue this conversation as well. But yeah, any questions? I see the chat has been pretty active.
Start with my question here, which is, why do you think there's less of an emphasis on energy? Like, is there some historic reason? Like, you think it'd be featured more prominently, being it's the largest source of our emissions and it's not close. But yeah, you kind of sort of mentioned that there wasn't as much focus on it, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts, some speculation about that.
So under the UN framework, they negotiate or sort of like look at the issue of climate change in mitigation and adaptation terms. So there's like what comes under mitigation is energy, but it's also about like cement, it's about like agriculture, it's everything to do with emissions is looked under mitigation, and everything to do with adaptation, like improving infrastructure, improving health systems, all of that is looked under adaptation. So there's sort of no specific negotiation for any of these issues, and I think that's the detriment of an issue like climate change, because energy is sort of so like it's overwhelmingly responsible for our emissions. And so if you don't give it the kind of specific attention that you need, it sort of gets left to the side. And every COP presidency before the COP, they say that we want to feature energy more. We want to have energy as a like a critical component of the negotiations. But it never really goes anywhere because there's no specific negotiation stream under the UNFCCC for energy. And that's why, like, even in the coming year in Brazil, even though they have said that we want to like remake the focus on energy again, that's just not happening.
How will the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Accords affect other countries and their decision making?
So the point of the U.S. participation in the UNFCCC is much more beyond the US's domestic capacity to like reduce emissions and like its domestic climate action. The US is a leader when it comes to a lot of these international negotiations. So for countries that are perhaps like falling behind or not as ambitious with their climate agreements, the US usually does work with them on like a bilateral basis to push their agreements up in terms of like their ambition, their like emission standards, all of those things. So that will be lost because of like the US connections with these countries. There's very little that another country can do to like fill that void up. That is a big loss for like the international community in this case. Then there's the idea of like domestic emissions that the US is going to do. The US NDC is out already, but it's no longer in effect because the US has sort of sanctioned to pull out of the Paris Agreement. This will take a few years, but the NDC is just as good as how much the government tried to implement it. And now that we know that the government has sort of lost its mandate from the NDC, they're no longer going to implement it. So the NDC made commitments to reduce emissions by 2035, 61 to 66%, the levels that they are now to 2025. So that's a huge reduction in emissions. And that will unfortunately no longer be the goal of a lot of climate policy coming out of the UN or any climate US, a lot of climate policy coming out of the US. Another big issue that I'd mentioned in the discussion itself was the fact that US is the largest contributor to climate finance and development finance, and that pot is no longer accessible to a lot of countries that require this funding to meet their climate action plans. So the knock-on effect is that since this happened last year, we know for a fact that the country ambitions for the next round of climate action plans is going to be significantly lower had the US still continued in the Paris Agreement. So the effects have already started being felt by countries that have to implement these plans because they know that that funding source is no longer available. And of course, going to have many more knock-on effects. But those are the three, I think, the main ones that I can highlight right now.
Really appreciate it, Gayatri. And yeah, always good working with you.